the canvas with a base color so the white doesn't show between the brush strokes.
Many artists work with a canvas laying flat like this. When your technique is kinetic, like Jackson Pollock's drip painting, the motion is easier when it's down below you. A lot of times you'll see artists working on an easel with the canvas propped up, and that's great for brush work when you're using your wrist. But for this kinetic style of scrape, I like to work with it below me on a table.
Art is created by building up layers. This is true in painting and photography. Here I'm applying different shades of blue and dabs directly onto the canvas. I want a balanced tonal variation and tonal similarity. I want the background to be a continuous sky, but I want it to be dynamic as well.
The scrape is both random and deliberate. It has an immediacy and a texture that I like. You get these ridges where the paint builds up and where the blade edge bites in and grabs. I also don't like to waste paint. Even if there is excess paint, I use it to prep another canvas. Think of the layers as weaving in contrast. If the top layer is going to be white clouds, then you need a little darker blue underneath to give it the contrast. You always need a tonal reference. Contrast draws human attention, and contrast is always relative, so white clouds go on top of dark blue. An orange Eiffel Tower over a blue sky is contrast the complementary colors. Again, it will draw attention. I'm using acrylic. I love oil, but it's harder to clean up your tools, and if you get any on your clothes or on the floor. It also takes far longer to dry, and it has a strong chemical smell. Acrylic is easier to use as a base. I like the thickness and texture of oil, especially for the scrape technique, and I put oil on the top layer, the one that shows. I like this aesthetic. It's what I see when I'm out taking street photography and architectural photography. Even a brand new building will very quickly get tire scuffs and showing the passage of time, and it's a storytelling aspect to me to see that things change. And also, any building that's been painted over, eventually the top layer will peel away and reveal what the paint was below it. So seeing layers, seeing passage of time is all storytelling to me. So I like this aesthetic of what I call industrial impressionist. It's the same color palette that Monet or Cezanne would have used, but it has a modern feel to it because it's the kinetic movement of the city, of a moving vehicle striking a concrete wall, or something else rubbing up against something else and revealing that there was a past underneath where it was painted blue and now it's painted green, and it's peeled back and you can see the blue through the green. What can be difficult for someone who's not an artist is that you're seeing things get painted over. So there's the base layer, and then there's multiple layers of this scrape paint that's going to get covered over by gray and then white, and then eventually the Eiffel Tower and the elephant. But that's part of the process. There's a lot of layers that are involved in photoshopping. There's levels of transparency. There's steps in the process. In anything that you do, there's an initial design, and then there's a foundation. So there's layers that are underneath the ones that you see on the surface, and they're as important. These layers of blue are going to be what give contrast to the Eiffel Tower and to the elephant. And so there is some thought to the darkness at the top with the ultramarine blue, and then there's more yellow coming through in the middle and in the bottom layer, so that there's a gradient of color. Adding in the turquoise and the yellow and the white is trying to make it a little more cheerful, the feeling of Paris in the spring. And then you need the darker colors at the top for the reference point for the white clouds.
think if I had more courage, I could build the paint up thicker and get even more of those ridges for the three-dimensional aspect. A canvas is an object in the room, whether it's your home or an office, and the light moves across it as it moves throughout the day, and it's a surface that's catching light, and that's a storytelling aspect to me as well. So I like seeing the depth and the thickness of the paint. I always have. I think of these as much as sculpture as I do as a painting. Here you just have to have the courage that you're going to cover that up and paint over what you've painted. So we're now on about the third or fourth layer. Negative space is incredibly important for art. What you think of as the background is actually a shape, and the amount of negative space is, if you think of like a luxury store, has fewer items, but if you go into a dollar store, it's crammed packed with things. So having a lot of negative space for the sky should draw more attention to the Eiffel Tower and to the elephant. Here's the inspiration. It's a painting by Jules Ernest Renault of an elephant statue that was by the Eiffel Tower. It's since been moved. All artists use sources of inspiration. Some people think that creativity is this magical thing that just pops out of your head, and it's almost always actually taking a starting point and then making it your own. Your own decisions in your own circumstance are going to give it a level of creativity. So what I'll do is start by looking at this composition and color palette, and after about the first couple of hours, I stop looking at it and let my canvas be what it wants to be, and I'm not just trying to make a direct copy. So when you see the original source and then you see my painting, I'm paying homage to this other piece of art, but I've created something that's my own. Adding the white can change the whole dynamic of the painting. There's a concept of greatest area of contrast. The greatest area of contrast is where the viewer's eye is going to go first before it explores anything else. So you can control that by, like, say, placing the bright white against the darkest ultramarine blue, or the bright white cloud behind the black silhouette of the elephant. Value and contrast are principles of graphic design, whereas texture that's being built up is an element of graphic design. And sometimes you see color seen as an element, sometimes it's more of a principle. How each of these elements interacts becomes a principle. So you're doing both. Each level of paint is creating ridges in a deeper level, and so the almost transparent aspect of the paint scraping and leaving evidence of what was below it it's because it's catching on the ridge of the previous level as it dries. The acrylic dries after about 20 minutes, definitely after an hour it's dry, where if I was painting with oil, it would take days for it to dry, so it would have a different blend to it. I like oil a lot. I actually prefer it, but it's just the drying time. So I'm able to paint a layer, wait about an hour, and then paint the next layer over it. But the layer underneath is helping to create the texture, because the paint scraper is catching on ridges and different surfaces, giving you an uneven pull across. I'm probably too worried about wasting paint. Sometimes I make a mistake by trying to use paint that really ought to just be thrown away or put to prep the next canvas. each movement is a choice that's affecting the entire canvas, and sometimes you make a mistake and you just keep going, and other times I think, should I stop? And because it is acrylic, you can pretty much wash it off. You can definitely take a wet rag and remove what you've done in the past few minutes before it dries. That same concept of undoing something, in essence, by scraping, I'm scraping off and partially undoing what I've just done, and then you'll see me also use a wet rag to cut through the paint and reveal more of the underpaint. The idea behind making these videos and commenting on them is for craftsmen. I mean, I'm not showing that I'm doing some kind of revolutionary technique, and you're not particularly going to learn some great new way of painting. But if someone like Leonardo da Vinci, if we had footage of him painting and you could see how long it took him to do certain tasks, how quickly he did other tasks, that would be enormously valuable to a craftsman. Like the footage we have of Picasso and Jackson Pollock, you get a sense of their deliberateness of their hand and watching their face as they make decisions is all incredibly valuable to another craftsman. So something like this, where you get the idea pretty quickly of what I'm doing, but then if I don't show you the time passing, you don't fully get a sense of how the layers are being built up, that this isn't just slapping the paint on and scraping it off. It's layer upon layer of color theory and contrast. You're playing with texture, and each time the paint has to dry, and you have to think forward what the next layer is going to be, thinking backwards on what the layer is underneath it. Seems a shame to cover up all that beautiful blue, and there's probably a little too much gray on there, but you need the gray so when the white goes on, the clouds have volume. I want to try this technique with a cubist painting. There's not much to say about just applying paint with a paintbrush other than typically paint from light to dark. The dark will cover over a lighter shade. And how much volume and three-dimensionality do you give to the elephant, and how much does it look like an impressionist painting with loose brush strokes? But I think the white and the gray gives just enough contrast to the silhouette of the elephant. It's been interesting going back and watching myself paint these, how slowly I move at times. Part of this is a hobby, and I do it because I enjoy the process of doing it. But I'm also painting these canvases for sale, and it's been an interesting lesson to think in terms of time management. Some of this looks like it could have been painted with a bigger brush, more deliberately, quicker, but it's both a job and a hobby. It's also easy to look back on this and say, well, I could have done that faster, but in the moment I'm discovering what the painting is going to look like, where now I have hindsight looking back on it. I spend most of my time as a photographer, and you're reacting to what's happening in front of you. And at best, you can change lenses or move your feet to change alignment and make a few camera settings. But with painting, you're building up every element instead of just responding to the elements that you find. You're creating the elements, and so each brushstroke can have a huge impact on the balance and the color theory and contrast and where attention goes. And you also have the ability to undo it, stop if you wanted to and wash it off. What I'm saying is I think you give more thought to each brushstroke, and so things are more deliberate and slower, where photography is largely about how fast can you push the button and respond to the visual elements or the storytelling that you're seeing in front of you. Putting down these yellows and this earth tone, and I know that it's going to ultimately be orange, but in my mind somehow if you just paint an orange Eiffel Tower, something like that would be too childish. So I think what I'm going for is more of a metallic building that's catching the sunset. It's catching the red-orange of the setting sun and the metals picking up on that. Also, I could do this again and commit to a more impressionistic Eiffel Tower, or I could go back and do one that's more architectural, or you could actually see the levels and the struts and they would look more like an engineering structure, where this is looking pretty random. I think you could do an entire Eiffel Tower of just the edge, that hard edge. I really like that a lot, and that gets covered up. That's probably a mistake. Yeah, I should have either have gone like an architectural drawing that looked like something that was engineered, or I should have gone full abstract. In the original painting, there's quite a bit of the park and levels of concrete and looks like people's clothing and things that are making all these pops of colors, and I decided to do something far simpler. And at one point I'd thought about having this kind of big purple sweep of the paint scraper across this kind of real kinetic whoosh, and I couldn't quite bring myself to do it. And then I really should have done that before I painted the elephant. So I spent more time painting this base than I would have thought, because you now have a counterpoint to the Eiffel Tower. So anything I did down here is distracting from the showstopper, which is supposed to be the Eiffel Tower and the elephant. But I couldn't just have those things floating in space. They have to be grounded. I prefer to paint with the trowel over a paintbrush most times. I like applying the paint and the thickness of it. It adds to the sculptural aesthetic. I think in my mind the Eiffel Tower is a frame, and it should have been more transparent. I think I should have let the blue come through more. You know that the Eiffel Tower is ultimately going to be orange, because blue and orange are complementary colors, and that's what makes the image work. But the Eiffel Tower is not orange, so it's a question of, does it start to look childlike, like a child's done something with crayons. The boldness of letting very, very bright, vivid colors come together. I mean, be juxtaposed, be adjacent to one another. Building up these colors, and then I put down the masking tape. The idea is to, scrape off and see what's underneath, but I don't want to scrape over into the blue, into the background too much. I think this is one time where if I'd painted with oil, I think I would have got a more interesting texture, and I think the underpaint would have been more interesting. The Eiffel Tower is the figure, the blue is the ground, figure ground. So the Eiffel Tower is the positive, and the blue sky is the negative. And then you're dealing with light-dark contrast and also blue-orange complementary color contrast. And this can make or break the image when you're basically just painting in some green foliage to ground it and link the image to the ground. And no one's ever going to pay any attention to the green unless you do it wrong. This is where I really deviated from the original painting that was the inspiration. He doesn't have trees or a base like this at all. He has more of the park. Thinking in terms of time management and how much more time I was going to spend on this painting with the base and tying it to the ground and making it look like Paris or making it look abstract. I didn't paint this on a heavy-duty gallery wrap, which is usually more expensive and is a signal that I'm going to spend more time on it, that I care more about the original idea. This is a study. It's not. I didn't come up with the idea of an elephant in front of the Eiffel Tower. It's based on a photograph and then of someone else's painting. But I am going to get to the point where I sign it and put my name on it. So it's got to be my painting, but I don't want to spend months on it. I want to spend a day or two, and I'm going to get paid, for that level of work. So I'm not really eager to put more work into it than I'm going to get paid for. Because I'm reaching the end, I like to take the oil and use that as the finishing layer, because if I'm down to like the last hour of painting, then I can paint the canvas and set it aside somewhere where it can. Oil paint has to cure. It's like the consistency of butter, and it takes really months before it's really hardened. You can paint oil and then go back a day or two later and touch it, and it'll move like the consistency of butter. And because I usually paint with my hand on the canvas, it's hard for me to paint with oil. Then you also have to have a place where you can put it and keep it. If you have a wet oil painting in your workspace or in your home and you forget and you brush up against it and it gets into your clothing, you almost can't get it out, and then you've ruined the painting. So a lot of thought has to go into where you're going to store an oil painting while it's curing, even when you're going to sell it, because you have to basically commit to keeping it for several months while it dries before you sell it to a client. But I do love the viscosity and the texture and the vibrancy of oil paint. The texture of the oil is so much more satisfying. A lot of times I'll even take acrylic and leave it out for 20-30 minutes so that it gets that tacky, sticky quality. I don't like working with it when it's the runny liquid, but the oil is really nice the way it goes on for this scrape technique. Of all the underlying colors and layers, this is what people see as this top layer, but these are tying in all the previous layers. This is the first time I've introduced that cobalt turquoise color and purple. Purple's real tricky because it either tends to be too red or too blue. It's hard to paint something that feels like the color purple. It almost always starts to look like a deep blue or like a wine color red. Is any piece of artwork ever really finished, or does the artist eventually just abandon it and move on to something else? I think a lot of artists feel that way, want to continue to rework something or repaint something. But as a professional, you have to reach a point where it's a finished product and you feel like you've spent enough time on it and that it is something you're going to be proud of when you look back. I have had work that I really didn't want to sign because I felt it was more of a craft and didn't have artistry to it. And then I have other canvases I'm quite proud to sign. I have bad handwriting, so this is actually one of the more difficult steps for me, is how big to make my signature and how bold to make it. I'm Daniel Arnauld, and thank you for staying to the end to watch this process of how I painted this canvas.